Greeting friends and colleagues in Germany and beyond. I'm delighted to join you from my home in Boston in the United States, where I teach at Tufts University, located on what was once the land of the Wampanoag. Here is my question. How can Western art museums, with their historical collections, inherited taxonomies, and aesthetic hierarchies, undertake meaningful change in response to social justice movements? I would like to share some thoughts on how these movements pose challenges to the way American art in particular is represented in art museums in the United States, especially the well-established museums on the East Coast. For those of you elsewhere, this may seem a provincial story. Yet, of course, the Decolonize movement is everywhere, and perhaps what I say may have relevance to you. Here in the US, decolonize signifies a fundamental discontent with the implicit and explicit biases of our cultural institutions. With respect to museums, it addresses the assumptions, hierarchies, and omissions that have long governed the acquisition, classification, and exhibition of objects and the stories they are made to tell. What I want to do today is to point to certain structural obstacles to greater inclusivity in those domains. Needless to say, the push for equity and inclusion, which carries a moral conviction and the momentum of generational change, poses significant challenges to all backward-looking museums. But I would argue art museums face an especially difficult challenge because from the beginning, they have propagated an elite conception of art that has naturalized overlapping hierarchies of aesthetic and social values in ways that limit more representative object-based storytelling. Simply put, you can't tell diverse stories without socially and aesthetically diverse objects. These embedded hierarchies dictate not only what is collected, but how it is exhibited, in effect inscribing and mapping privilege, as well as its absence, onto the physical space of the museum. The inevitable outcomes of this bias are unfortunately palpable and problematic in the representation of American art within traditional American art museums. The origin of the problem goes back to the birth of the American Art Museum, which sought to incorporate the high art gallery guided by aesthetic quality and the European canon, and the Cultural History Museum based on German and Swiss prototypes. Over time, cultural history was absorbed into the dominant high art museum, and in the process of assimilation, only historical objects deemed to be of superior aesthetic quality were regarded as worthy of collection. Drawing on elite objects, the American galleries of museums in Boston, New York, and elsewhere were molded into a patriotic narrative of moral and military ascent from the first colonial settlements in the 1600s to political and artistic maturity in the American Revolution and early Republic. This mythic origin story suited both museum patrons and administrators, who saw their own family histories embodied in the art and architectural fragments brought together in period ensembles. Only objects they considered masterpieces legitimized their hereditary claims to elevated taste, while also demonstrating native artistry on a par with British achievement. Not surprisingly, the heroic tale of colonial evolution came with no recognition of how the colonies in turn colonized indigenous lands and subjugated its people. The arts of Native Americans were nowhere in sight. For traditional American collections wanting to revise these still mostly intact narratives, two strategies have lately been pursued. First, existing works of art may be given new labels with contextual information about subject and ownership. At the Worcester Art Museum in Massachusetts, for example, colonial portraits now have additional labels revealing connections to the transatlantic slave trade. The problem with this approach is that it can only achieve inclusion in a negative way by representing marginalized people as both subjugated and absent. A second, more affirming strategy entails opening museum hierarchies to include non-elite objects made by and of underrepresented people. In other words, what has traditionally been classified as folk or vernacular art. Recent examples of taxonomic expansion include the purchase by the Metropolitan Museum of anonymous studio portraits of African Americans from the 1940s, and the acceptance of a gift of recent so-called outsider art. It remains to be seen how these objects end up being used in permanent collections, which are still largely governed by distinctions between high and low art. I should add that in 2018, the first Native American art was shown at the Met. The hierarchical mapping of different art forms and visual traditions onto the physical space of the museum may be clearly seen in the new Art of the Americas wing at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. When it opened just 10 years ago, it was praised for offering a more sensitive and inclusive vision of American art. That it already seems in need of revision shows how quickly the cultural landscape is shifting. The boldest innovation of the wing was to go beyond European-inspired art of the United States to feature the visual culture of Latin America and Native Americans, justifying the plural Americas in its title. However, the placement of Latin and Native material on the lowest level below ground to suggest historical precedence and perhaps rootedness in the American soil subtly reinforced the marginalization and primitivizing of those cultures dating back to the early 20th century. The main floors above are given over to an impressive historical survey of colonial art and its legacy, represented by high-style paintings, sculpture, furniture, silver, etc., for which the museum is best known. Period environments frame portraits of Boston's illustrious revolutionaries and the luxury goods that ornamented their lives. Yet if one penetrates deeper into the Americas wing, away from the main axis of power, you find an equally exceptional collection of folk art, which includes paintings and domestic objects made by women and artists of color. Though folk art and the art of the elite are contemporaneous, the two represent different social and aesthetic spheres and are as segregated spatially in the museum as their makers were in life. Prioritization of museum space is a key metric of exclusion. One solution to the problem of representation in traditional American galleries with their period decor would be to wipe them clean and start over. And one dramatic instance of such an effort may be found at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, where a set of installations titled "The Many Voices of Colonial America" show us the way. To give one example, period rooms from South Carolina, acquired to showcase elite colonial taste, have been transformed through the incorporation of Cherokee and African objects, labeling and video commentary by living community members, into a multisensory tableau revealing a complex history of intersecting lives and culture. The museum webpage declares, "Now other voices are heard in these rooms, telling their own stories." These newly modified rooms offer a bold vision of what a reimagined past might offer the future of the American Art Museum. I'm not able to show you these spaces in this talk, but I encourage you to go online and check them out for yourselves. And I look forward to conversation in the deep dive that follows. Thank you.
You